Sound, music, sustainability. Welcome to Sustain FM. Hello everyone, I'm Steve Williams, aka Drew's Noise, the host of Sustain FM. Every morning, if we're awake, we can hear the dawn chorus, the sound of birds and insects and animals waking up. But what do we really hear? How do those sounds change around the world? And what about the underwater chorus? Can we hear that too? Today we speak with Grant Smith and Mort Drew, both part of the Soundtent collaborative that organizes the Reveil project, a 25-hour-long streaming of the dawn chorus around the world. We talk about sound, listening, and working collaboratively in ecological sound projects. It was a fascinating conversation. We listened together to some streams, underwater and above ground. Just a warning, the streams are pretty quiet, so make sure to listen on headphones and turn up the volume when we listen. We talk in the conversation about flat listening, and I encourage you to practice that for today's show. So now on to the show. All right, so Mort and Grant, thank you so much for taking the time to chat today. I'm really looking forward to the conversation, and yeah, I'm a little bit jealous seeing all the cables and wires hanging in the background. So I immediately know there's at least some kind of commonality of spirit seeing that. And I guess before we get into some of the work around Reveil and some of the streaming things, one of the things that I'm curious about is I know both of you have your own individual artistic practices, and you also have your collaboration, this one, and then I'm probably other ones as well. And I'm always curious about artistic collaborations. How did yours come together, and kind of what prompted you to collaborate? Because I'm always mindful of that sort of old cliche, if you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. And the going together part and collaborating is a lot of fun, but anytime there's two people, there's always more stuff that comes along with collaboration. So I'm curious what you feel your collaboration brings or allows or facilitates that's more than your own individual practices.
Should we start?
I mean, maybe we would start by saying that the two of us are part of a wider cooperative of 9 or 10 artists, with a sort of core in London and then others in other places. So, and maybe to say that we're a little over 10 years old as a cooperative, and that different people have joined at different times.
Mm-hmm. Is this the sound camp that you're talking about, or?
Indeed.
Okay. Right.
And it's an intergenerational cooperative as well. So I'm in my mid-20s and Grant is not in his mid-20s, and there's a range of artists in this group with different levels of experience. So I actually joined whilst I was still an undergrad student studying sound arts at the London College of Communication, or CRISAP if people are familiar with ecological and environmental sounds. And I joined thanks to some funding that Soundcamp received from Creative Europe as part of the Acoustic Commons project to hire 2 young producers. So there was a conscious effort within the cooperative to bring in other artists with different backgrounds, and my solo practice has sort of developed alongside being in Soundcamp because I was so young when I joined, and still am to some degree. But yeah, it's a group. We were actually talking about some of this on a train ride not that long ago, because I don't think it's solo working and working as a group in the way that we work as a group, with lots of collaborations and lots of time for each other. They're not against each other. They're sort of part of the same branch, I think. But perhaps you have a different perspective.
I think of the collaborative aspect as kind of in ecological terms. So I guess we work with sounds. I remember Hildegard Westerkamp talking about collaborating with field recordings, right? So I mean we don't work so much with field recordings, but we do talk about the idea of complicity with live materials. So I feel as if as an ecological project, we're interested in the social the kind of social forms in which we work, and maybe also to some extent ourselves as ecological, kind of multiples, and then of course the environmental ecologies that we work with. So I agree in that sense with very much with Mort, that it's not I don't feel like it's a contradiction for us. There's a kind of a continuity between those ways of working.
Right. That's really interesting, taking that ecological approach. And it's actually a perfect segue into another question I had around, you talked about sort of the field recordings and complicity with soundscapes, I think was your phrase. And so the idea of listening to the environment has been around for a long time, ever from Rachel Carson writing Silent Spring to soundscape work to ecological sound art to bioacoustics. And I'm curious, what do you see, or maybe hear is a better phrase, differently with your approach than some of those approaches?
I think one of the things that I feel comes out is a kind of a preparedness for things not to work. When you work with a field recording, or I'm thinking of when I've seen presentations of people, they have that material. Mm-hmm. They've recorded that material. They were potentially on site when that material was recorded. They've sat with it. They've worked with it. And then when it's presented as an object or a solid thing, or it's not always presented in those terms, but there is a reliability in working with a field recording. And the way that we work with live transmissions, there are lots of holes, lots of drops. You anticipate that you might not be able to hear what you are expecting to hear. And because a lot of the way that we work is through collaborations with other people who might have certain preconceptions about, if we're going to make a radio show, then we need to have this, and we need to have this object, and we're listening for this bird, so we need to make sure we can hear those things. But actually the reality is that when we listen through these omnidirectional microphones and stream boxes and live streams, that you often hear quite a lot of, you hear around those sounds that you're listening out for. You hear the road noise, you hear the airplane traffic, you hear the person coughing who's near the microphone, that maybe if you were working with a field recording and you were trying to show or share a certain site or place or creature or a collection of those things in ecology, you might remove those certain aspects. But when you're working with the live, you don't have such control over being able to remove things. You can dip a level, say, for example, if someone's being incredibly obnoxious near a microphone, you think that's probably not something that we want to inflict on others. You can have some control, but also that comes with a conscious element of deciding who gets to hear what and why you're making those decisions. We sometimes talk about being an anti-hierarchical collective, working flatly, working with each other, holding the same responsibilities or sharing responsibilities. And that translates also into the sound work. When we are mixing a live broadcast, there is some acknowledgement that ultimately whoever is at the mixer has the control over what gets heard, and that then has its own responsibilities. And that's something that we think about as a group when making work.
That's really interesting. I definitely resonate with that. And I've seen similar kind of phenomena when I do my own, or one kind of workshop I do is really like a table full of gear and plants and light sensors, heartbeat sensors, and it's very interactive, getting people to make sounds with environment, with bodies, with plants, and the key word there is with, so that kind of interspecies, intertechnology collaboration. But one of the things that inevitably happens is that, someone playing with a heartbeat monitor plugged into a modular synth can't really hear themselves, so they turn themselves up, which means that some playing with and all of a sudden it's just like totally overwhelmed. So you're right, who's at the mixer? And I kind of use that as a bit of a subtle way when there's, say, like a dozen people around the table, as that metaphor for, as you talked about, the collaboration of who speaks, who decides who speaks, who turns up the mixer. It's because I'm not sure how you found, but I found like introducing broader concepts of social justice, environmental justice can kind of go over people's heads sometimes. But something so concrete is who's at the mixer. that's a very they can see that person, someone's turning the knobs up and down, someone's moving the sliders, someone's deciding we don't want to hear you anymore. It gives like interesting kind of way into that conversation. Yeah. Interesting. Yeah. And maybe another question related to that is, so you've talked a little bit about the way that the collective works, and a little bit about the way that your own practice works, working with streaming and so on. But I'm also curious how you feel that way of working, or that way of performance, or that way of interaction can help audiences experience things in a different way, or experience the environment through sounds in a different way. And I was talking with a colleague the other day, and he was kind of talking about that sort of in his opinion, a lot of environmental sound projects are kind of framed around kind of two directions, where one is the general raising awareness of the environment. And I guess Silent Spring is a perfect example of that. The spring is silent, we're doing bad things, we need to take care of the environment better. And then another way, which is sort of more prevalent, I think, in bioacoustics and conservation acoustics, is kind of using sound as an indicator of ecosystem health, so we can actually measure and monitor those things. But it feels, from what I'm saying, that you're taking a bit of a different approach, that there's elements of those, but it seems like you're trying to kind of get at something different in terms of how audiences experience sound in the environment. Do I have that right?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, it's a trick. It's kind of a big subject. I'm wondering a good way into it, but I would say that from the beginning, there's always been a very active role for the participants in the work. So I can think of many examples of work with environmental sound that essentially prepare these quite elaborate, quite sort of passive listening situations, right, in which, as you say, you're kind of static, or sound comes to you, and then you sometimes are meant to you're meant to learn certain lessons from that, or whatever it may be. I mean, when we first proposed the Reveil Around the Earth broadcast in 2014, we invited people to come and send us live streams from their locations. And so the piece emerged as the result of those contributions. So already there's a sense of kind of agency there for people that is a little bit unusual. And I think that's pretty much been a guiding approach, throughout the process. This idea that by listening together with other people, you're already kind of contributing to a kind of collective experience, and then there's this possibility to stream to the broadcast, and there's a possibility to set up a sound camp as this kind of low impact intervention in a space, or way of being in a space together. And so there's like paths towards what some folks are calling ecological citizenship, but definitely paths towards kinds of creativity that are sort of feel active and together with others.
That's really interesting. I like it, because it's just kind of bouncing around in some of my notes here, but one of the questions that I'm always curious about, because this podcast and radio show is all about artists working with sound, music, and sustainability in different ways. And one of the questions that I'm always curious about with other artists and in my own work is sort of balancing this engaging the audience in some kind of message or experience without tipping over into being a lecture or a public service announcement. And I'm sure we've all sort of been, as you reflect that, and it's like, okay, yeah, I get it. I should recycle more. And this is not very artistically interesting, but I guess I should recycle more. But that's really fascinating, because I haven't heard that approach before. But it sounds like, for what you're saying, that by engaging the audience in a participatory co-creation, that they're not, in some ways you don't need to worry about that, because they're not sort of passively listening and wondering whether they get it or not. They're actually co-creating that performance. That's a really interesting approach. Yeah. Was that kind of a goal of the project when you started, or did that sort of emerge through building the Reveil project?
Well, for myself, I would say it definitely was not a goal that it emerged through, just because my own sense of the way certainly I work, and I think that's true to some extent. Also, the cooperative is that we try things on a more or less kind of instinctive or practical sort of way, and it's only really in retrospect that we try to understand what we're doing. So,
Right.
but I definitely don't think that we were kind of like cultural operators setting out to increase audience agency, from the get-go. And we were basically trying to create this quite kind of tricky thing, which was to create this sort of continuous auditory account of the earth, as a big thing, and to feel its volumes and everything, and basically to get through there without a bunch of silence, right? So we were trying to. And the way to do that was to ask for help. So I think it's only later maybe that's also as from pandemic times, when there's a lot more critical thinking about the way streaming operates and the way hybrid kinds of events can be good and bad in terms of the sorts of social patterns and kinds of how they work for different people. That maybe we've thought about that a little bit more.
And also thinking in your examples about lectures and public service announcements, these are things in which someone is dictating through speech often a message or this and the other. The Reveil broadcast doesn't include that much speech. And also, if people do want to find out about it or ask a question, there is an IRC that runs on the webpage, like an old school 90s chat room.
Cool.
And this allows people to talk with each other without having to log into any accounts. You can set your own nickname. You can be anonymous or as declared as you want to be. And I think in withholding like outcomes or messages or like declarations of what you should be experiencing, this allows people to come to it with their own thoughts, and then explore those thoughts with other people as they either participate in the broadcast or listen to the broadcast and write with others and listen with others. And also simultaneously to the Reveil broadcast are a series of listening events called sound camps, which is where the organization gets its name from, where people get together to listen together. And so by making, like you're saying, hybrid ways for people to engage with the sound, you can listen at home, you can listen on the radio, you can listen on the webpage, you can come to an event, you can set up your own event. Like that, I think that allows for a lot of different connections to the work, which then allows for lots of different permutations to come through.
That's cool. All right. So maybe before we jump into talking about the Reveil project, because you mentioned a couple of elements, but I want to dig into that a little bit more. Why don't we sort of take an opportunity to actually do some of that listening to a stream? So you suggested a stream that's labeled Waterhall Dew Pond. Do you want to? Where is this coming from? What's the back? Where do you know where the stream is originating geographically?
This is in England, in the South Downs, so the south of England, in a project which is rewilding a golf course. Okay. And so what we're going to listen to a stereo pair of hydrophones in a dew pond, which is filled from the dew of the Offren of the hills around it. And I lost my sentence as I was saying it. That's basically where it is and what we're listening to.
Maybe we could just add that it's, as always with so much of the work, it's a collaboration with Alice Eldridge at the University of Sussex and the site managers at Waterhall, which is, as Mort says, this really intriguing conversion of land use from a golf course, a sort of monoculture, into an increasingly diverse kind of habitat where you can sort of still see the remain of the fairways, but things are changing quite quickly.
There's lots of cows on them.
Lots of cows on them. Okay, great. Okay, well, let's take a listen to this then.
Great.
Well, that's okay. That's amazing. I could have listened to that for much much longer. It's and I'm really curious about that coming for. Okay, like I could do a whole hour-long interview with you just on that on that recording. But you mentioned it was the stereo microphone, so I was kind of hearing those different sounds in each ear. Some of those sounds almost seemed like they were kind of blending, kind of like right down the center. I'm going to patent the word blendering, and into the center. But I also wanted to come back to, you mentioned your use of sort of omnidirectional microphones and sort of the, I think you used the word flattening or so about the streaming. I can't remember exactly the word there. So I'm curious what that relationship is between this stream that had the stereo microphones and also the omnidirectional. And do you see those as just kind of different versions of the same thing, or providing a different listening experience or a different relationship with sound?
I mean, those hydrophones are fantastic hydrophones. They're designed by David Rothenberg and based off a design by Zach Poff. And they allow you to hear things in freshwater that maybe sometimes you don't often hear through other hydrophones, because they're expecting a lot more energy, because they're designed for things like deep sea listening or whale noise, vast amounts of energy, when often in ponds and such there is not that level of power. And in fact, Alice Eldridge told us that some of those pops that we're listening to was actually air, or I guess, produced by the photosynthesizing of the plants in the, so they're quite small amounts of energy that we're hearing. And they do give this incredible sense of space. And so though they're not technically perhaps maybe omnidirectional, I haven't looked at the
No, pretty close.
Yeah, they're really
close to omni.
And they're so vivid, I would say. And they pull out pull out maybe isn't the right word. They allow us to hear in so much detail things that maybe we haven't been able to hear before. And the omnidirectional microphones are again the same thing, because often when we listen with our ears, we self-select sounds internally. So we might block out. It's like that classic thing. If it's been raining for 4 hours and then it stops raining, that is when you hear that the rain has stopped. But consciously, we're not registering that it's raining. We're not consciously registering that the air flight path is over our heads and we're hearing those sounds all this time. But the omnidirectional microphones, they don't self-select. And I think the act of listening to something away from yourself through the live stream, it sort of prevents us from doing that self-selecting. Unless someone is speaking, I found that often if someone is speaking near a microphone, I will still, even after all these years, sort of focus on the speech. And it's actually a listening practice to try and listen in this open and flat way. I think that might be your term, actually, flat listening, eventless listening, or a term that you used a lot that I certainly learned from you. By you, I'm referencing Grant for this.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, it's a nice question. I found when I was listening with everyone, with the Waterhall stream, that it makes me, I feel quite sort of enthusiastic about it. And actually I find it easier than to sort of speak and articulate things with reference to, to those sounds, rather than just trying to, as they say, pull words out of the air. And so there's a few things came to mind listening with that one. I mean, one is that there's this sort of intriguing legacy that Mort mentions, is that, there's a piece by David Dunn called The Emergent Mind of the Pond that was very important to Zach Poff, who's extraordinary artist and technologist in New York State. And for the first Reveil, Zach was commissioned to do this piece called Pond Station. That's a live stream from a pond in Acre in the Upper Hudson Valley, New York. And that piece continues, that work continues. I think it's sort of becoming a really major, kind of significant piece of public art. And basically it involves these hydrophones dangling down from a floating solar powered platform with a radio relay to the studio at Wavefarm, which is itself a kind of really important node of transmission arts in the US. And through this sort of study over a decade, Zach has developed these extraordinary hydrophones, which like Mort says, they just elicit a much more nuanced and plural, account of these freshwater ecosystems than has ever, I think, really existed before. And so and then that David, in collaboration with David Rothenberg, those became available to us, and you can buy a pair. And we used two because spaced at about a meter, because sound travels more slowly, as I understand it, in water than in air. So you get a sense of the pond as a space, as a volume, but also as a social space. So you can hear different organisms calling to each other as you would perhaps hear birdsong in a woodland. So it immediately gives you a much more sense of this sort of collective thing that we keep coming back to. And then finally, because a long response, but finally, in terms of the flatness, I mean, what it occurs to me on that is that the idea of the flat and the homogeneous and so forth is very often considered, we associate it as a negative thing. It's associated with late capitalism and the sort of flattening effect of certain kinds of flows of capital and information. But like Mort said, there is an interest in just suspending value judgments and trying to listen equally across the sound world. And one of the things that really intrigues me about Waterhall is a sort of extraordinary ignorance about the actual identification of what is the sound sources, and it seems to span from these kind of biochemical processes through to, sometimes there are lots of what are these things called? Toads singing in the pond, or frogs, and you hear people's voices, you hear aircraft and traffic, because it's actually, the pond is in a traffic-ridden site, actually, interesting, which is another thing. So in summary, there's something about the plurality and the sort of democratic quality of the sound world that comes from listening in that sort of slightly alienized way to a pond that seems promising to us.
Right. So, okay, I want to hold that thought around the democratic piece of that, because I want to talk a little bit more about the Reveil project, which will take place around the Dawn Chorus Day, I think. And I wanted to ask maybe for a bit of an explanation, because not everyone who's listening to this will know what that phrase Dawn Chorus actually means. So could you kind of let us know what the Dawn Chorus is and why that's an interesting focal point for the broadcast? Or maybe broadcast is not the right term?
Would you like to? Because interestingly, there is a dawn and a dusk chorus.
Okay.
It happens twice, both around the sun. You seem...
Yeah, I mean, I'll try to do brief there, because that was a very long response. I mean, in French, it's actually called Chant des oiseaux à l'aube. So it's explicitly about birds, right? But in English, it refers to this increase in the volume and also the variety of sounds that happens in the time just around first light. So in between civil twilight, which is officially the first appearance of light, to the time of sunrise. And this has to do with the way organisms of all kinds are kind of organized around circadian rhythms and our various kinds of internal clocks. So it's a very, I mean, lots of field recorders also know, of course, that this is a very key time to listen. It's a good time to listen also because human origin sounds are relatively low. And so it feels like there's a bit more parity in the sound world than there sometimes is. And for those of us who've gone out at that crazy time to listen to things, there is something very memorable about the quiet of the night, the darkness, and then the sound of that kind of first bird kind of dropping into the darkness. And I mean, it verges a little bit on cheesy, but there is something there is something about it. And then of course it gets light, and that is itself a good that's something that people look forward to as well.
Right. Okay. So okay. Thanks for that explanation, because it for me that kind of circles back to Yeah, asking about this project, because you mentioned, I think at the beginning of our chat, something about the hearing the sound of the earth as a sphere, because obviously that dawn, that magical time, given that the earth is a sphere, that's not happening at exactly the same time everywhere in the world. So I find that a fascinating part about the project and the collective nature of that. And I'm interested in that for a couple of reasons. One is I do a lot of participatory workshops that I think align a lot with your vision and your work, but almost all of them are in person, which is great because I have physical interaction with people. They can touch things, but of course is limited because there's only a certain number of people that can fit into the room. There's only a certain number of places that I can get to. But with this sort of global piece, one of the things I find interesting is not only that it gives you that access to that chorus in different physical locations, hearing those different sounds, but you've also provided people with instructions on how to stream and instructions on how to do those soundscapes. So it's that kind of collaborative nature as well, which gets back to that kind of democratic piece. So I'm not exactly sure what my question is here, because we talked a little bit about that before, but maybe I'll kind of rephrase the question a little bit from what I was going to ask is maybe this idea of the flattening, because in terms of one sense of flat listening, I understand, or I think I understand this idea of not listening for the specific events and sort of hearing that totality. And on the other hand, almost by nature, when you flip between different streams, you are hearing quite different things. So because there's there's sort of a flattening and also a spikiness, maybe, when you sort of move from one sound to another, or one stream to another. So I'm curious sort of how you see the relationship between flatness and spikiness, which could be the title of a book we write together, The Flat Spiky World or something.
I think about it in two parts. One in the aesthetics of sound, like as the sounds move from place to place, like you say, dramatic changes in volume, dramatic changes in content of sound. But also as well, one of the harshest spikes that appear within the broadcast, to use your word, spiky, is when a stream drops. If you've been listening to something for several hours, as you often might end up doing with the Reveil broadcast, because it's 24 plus 1 hours long, when something drops, that is the most, and by drop I mean when a stream loses connection, or the streamer stops streaming whilst you're expecting to continue relaying it. You're greeted with this silence, and it's not actual silence, because actually you're just hearing the sounds around you wherever you are. But it's so it's hard to articulate, because it is almost a physical feeling. I think when listening to live streams from a place that's not where you are, there is an act for me personally in transportation, in travel, in listening away from yourself and listening into this. Sometimes you're like, when you're listening to a live stream, like for example, listening to Waterhole there, we're remaining within one location, within two microphones, and there is lots to hear in that sound world. But you're staying there. With Reveil, you're moving from location to location. So Reveil itself becomes a sort of site, maybe. And you rely on either the announcer to say, we've now moved to, and then they will announce where we're now listening to, or the visual input from the Reveil webpage, which is where someone can create what we call a stream page, which has an image and a text and some context about what it is that we're listening. So and those are slightly different, because you can take in sonic information whilst reading and they don't seem to interfere. And having an announcer say something is an interruption. Whereas it's like, and I think within the way that we mix Reveil, moving from stream to stream, because there is someone at a dial, and they're not necessarily in London. We have guest mixers, Fernando Godoy in Chile and Leah Barkley in Australia. And there is it is also a technical, like a sound engineer is moving from location. They're previewing the sound before they move to it. They know, okay, we're about to move to somewhere that's streaming from a city where perhaps there is this loud noise. I'm not going to bring that stream in to quite the same level that we maybe have just had in the ocean, for example, where it's maybe not as loud. So there is some sound engineering, some technical work being done to make sure that we don't have such jots.
Right,
But
right.
these are different. Yeah.
Interesting. Right. Well, I can't wait to hear that coming up. So that's coming up in what are the dates of this the next Reveil? That's in early May, I believe.
It is the 3rd to the 4th of May, 2025.
Okay,
We begin
perfect.
broadcasting at 5 a.m. In London, so UTC +1.
Okay.
And we will finish broadcasting at 6 a.m. UTC +1 on the Sunday. So it travels for 24 hours and then an extra hour, which Grant sometimes refers to as the coda, which I quite like.
Okay, nice. And people can find that at soundtent.org. Is that the okay? Okay, perfect. Yeah, and we'll make sure to include links in the show notes to that, plus also some of the authors and sound artists you mentioned, and yeah, I'd love to get a link to that, to those hydrophones as well, because I'll be doing some river hydrophone recording in May in Oslo, in and around hydroelectric dams, which will be quite a wide variation, because the above the dam is very much like a pond, not really kind of much happening. But then immediately below the dam, when the water's been gone through the spillway, it's a very different environment. So I'll be recording. Yeah, it depends how much time I can have, but ideally it's sort of 100 or 500 meter kind of increments up above and below the dam, to sort of be able to hear some of that kind of variation. So yeah, well, this was amazing. Thanks so much for the conversation. And we usually close the show with a recording of a live performance, but I think in this case it actually makes more sense to have. We can add in a couple of the stream recordings so people can get an idea of some of those different pieces. And we listened to the. I was going to say waterfall, but not waterhall. Sorry. Is there another one or two that you wanted to act as announcer to set up for what people might want to, what people are going to hear?
One of my personal favorite streams on the server is called Jasper Ridge, and it's from the Jasper Ridge Biological Preserve in Santa Cruz. And I've listened to it for many years, and it's been run by a person called Trevor Herbert.
Herbert.
Yeah.
Okay.
From that site for over 6 years now, maybe. It's one of the oldest.
Longer. Yeah, it's old. I mean, it's the field studies like research station of Stanford University, and Trevor started this project called Birdcast that eventually moved onto the Locusonus server. And like Mort says, it's another one of these things that is both ephemeral but also has this extraordinary sort of authority to it, as a work. So I would definitely listen into that.
And those are omnidirectional air microphones, but they also often contain frogs, and so we might have a frog relationship between one.
Yeah, because the dawn chorus, I think we didn't quite manage to complete that thought, but it's not always birds by any means. So amphibians also vocalize more at daybreak, and there's an underwater dawn chorus of shrimp and fish and so forth that we will probably hear from Queensland with Leah Barkley on the day.
Excellent. Great. Well, can't wait to hear that. Thanks again so much, Mort and Grant, for taking the time to chat. And I encourage everyone to tune in to the Reveil project on Dawn Chorus Day. And as I mentioned, we'll include links to that in the show notes, so you can hear the Dawn Chorus around the world. So thanks again.
Thank you very much.
Thanks.
Steve.
It's been very nice speaking. Thanks very much.
Thank you. Okay, thanks for listening to Sustain. Hope to catch you again next time. Be sure to sign up for our email list on our website, sustain.fm. Follow our Instagram, also sustain.fm. You get more info on the radio show, in-person events in different cities, live streams, and more. All right, until next time, see you on the dance floor.